My name's Paul Adler, and I'm a professor in the Management and Organization Department and the Harold Quinton Chair of Business Policy here at the Marshall School of Business. I'd like to talk with you today about the challenge posed to our economic system by climate change. According to widely endorsed expert assessments, if we stay on our current course, then over the coming few decades, indeed within our children's lifespans, the US will see increasingly frequent and destructive wildfires, hurricanes, heat waves, and ice storms. Lower rainfall levels and water tables will cause massive crop failures. Rising sea levels will force millions of people to flee from coastal areas around the US. Other parts of the globe will be even more dramatically impacted. Climate scientists tell us that the world must get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest to have a reasonable chance of avoiding chaotic breakdown. Moreover, wealthier countries like the US, we need to fully decarbonize much faster than that, much faster than that, by, they say, 2030 at the latest, to accommodate poorer countries' slower decarbonization trajectories. As I see it, this challenge goes to the core of our capitalist economic system, and to meet that challenge, I don't see any alternative but to transition to a socialist system, one where our development path is set by government planning rather than by markets. And in this brief talk I want to explain why I think the challenge goes so deep, and why we have reason to believe that this socialist system could well work. First, why the challenge goes so deep? In order for us to reduce emissions fast enough, industry will be forced to abandon or rebuild assets worth trillions of dollars. We need not only to shut down rapidly the fossil fuel companies like Chevron, ExxonMobil, Peabody Coal, but also radically transform the material assets of companies whose products run on oil, companies like General Motors, Boeing, United Airlines, Federal Express. And further afield, there's vast swaths of our economy whose products and processes contribute to climate change, and which therefore have to be radically and rapidly transformed. Think of agriculture, cement, mining, forest products, chemicals, plastics, and many consumer products. Further afield again, the climate crisis is going to force on us a massive effort to shore up the resilience of our energy systems, water, transportation infrastructures, to deal with rising sea levels and more extreme weather. This is a pretty dire outlook, and let's be honest, companies can't be expected voluntarily to make changes of this magnitude this fast. They simply can't put themselves out of business, nor saddle their shareholders with huge losses for years to come. Yes, it's true, doing good for the environment can sometimes make for good business. More sustainable businesses can attract more environmentally conscious customers and employees and investors. But we simply can't make progress fast enough if we rely only on win-win solutions of that kind, the ones that smart firms will make all by themselves. First, many firms simply can't afford to make many of the necessary changes. Second, in some cases, perhaps they could afford to make them if they raised their prices, but they could only survive if competitors followed suit. So we would need strong government regulation to block the low-road competitors that would otherwise eat their market share. And then finally, some of our problems need systemic solutions that can't emerge through that bottom-up market process, like rebuilding our infrastructure or making the long-term investments in advanced research and development, such as the government does through agencies like the National Institutes for Health and the DARPA. Given the massive strain on the solvency of so many businesses that this rapid transition would entail, it's difficult to see how that transition happens without government planning replacing in large measure the market process. Of course, the idea of such an expansive scope for government planning of the economy rings alarm bells for many people. It's hard to see how such a system, where government planning replaces markets, could be effective or democratic, let alone both. But my research suggests we have something like a working model of just such a system right under our noses in many of our largest corporations. Indeed, most corporations don't leave the various business units that compose them to compete with each other, but rely instead on strategic planning to coordinate the production, investment, and other plans across their various business units to achieve the best outcomes for the corporation as a whole. In miniature, that in the microcosm of the individual corporation, that's much the same planning process as government would use to strategically coordinate the activity of enterprises across industries and across the country to meet our environmental challenges. Moreover, I would say, in this internal strategic planning process, corporations confront in miniature the same challenges that have bedeviled government economic planning on a wider scale. So I want to focus on two of the biggest of these challenges, democracy and innovation. And I want to put to you today that corporations have developed rather effective techniques to deal with these challenges, to develop planning approaches that can be scaled up and ensure democracy and innovation, efficiency and effectiveness in the management of this socialist economy's effort to grapple with the climate change challenge. So let's start with the question of democracy in planning. It's hard to see government economic planning over such a vast and complex economy could be democratic. But it will need to be. If it's not, it won't adequately reflect the opportunities and challenges experienced by citizens and enterprises. And people won't put much effort into the goals decreed at that higher centralized level. Planning in business units confronts the same challenge. Many firms see the potential benefits of strategic coordination as compared to letting their business units just compete with each other for profitability. But the top-down character of their planning process means that their corporate plans don't reflect the opportunities and challenges experienced by the business units. And then those units have little reason to embrace the goals that top executives have decreed. To overcome that challenge, some firms have become a lot smarter about which decisions need to be centralized and which are better left to be handled by the business units. And firms have developed very impressive techniques for engaging the participation of middle-level and lower-level managers, and in some cases even a frontline staff, in the development of these strategies. That typically happens, as you all know, in the sort of three traditional cycles of planning and setting goals, planning, implementation, and allocating funds. And in each of those cycles, top executives formulate proposals, elicit feedback from below, and then revise their proposals in light of that feedback. It's not hard to see how this strategic management process could be made more democratic and how such dialogues could be broadened and scaled up in the socialist planning process. Imagine that our nationally elected leaders, examining the problems and opportunities the country faces, proposes a set of goals for the next 5 or 10 years that address the climate crisis but also our other economic and social needs. A wide process of democratic consultation with face-to-face meetings in workplaces and neighborhoods, in regional governing bodies, via digital polls. Through all these means we could get feedback back up to the central government planners and have them revise their goals accordingly. The refined goals could then be sent back out to democratically elected industrial and regional councils, asking them to propose plans for how they can contribute to achieving the plan's objectives. Those plans can then be collated centrally, and any consistencies or gaps they could prompt a round of revision. Finally, in a third cycle, budgets are allocated by the National Investment Bank in accordance with the goals and plans we've all agreed to, and local participatory budgeting forums can decide precisely how those budgets are used. The second big challenge we face is innovation. We're going to need a lot of innovation and deep research and development to confront this climate crisis, and government can mobilize massive resources to support that effort. But to many people's eyes, centralized planning seems particularly problematic when it comes to innovation. Many people assume that those choices are better made from the bottom up. Otherwise, innovation efforts risk being poorly targeted and not addressing the real needs of industry. Interestingly, many corporations struggle with exactly the same tension within that microcosm of the firm. They recognize the potential benefits of centralized R&D over reliance on market competition to drive innovation in their business units. Centralized R&D units can be funded through taxes on the business units and can avoid duplication of innovation efforts across those business units. Centralized R&D can also ensure that research looks further out into the future than the business units would be willing to do in their local R&D efforts. But this kind of specialization between centralized R&D and local innovation often leaves the centralized units out of touch with the needs of the business units. R&D ends up developing concepts that the production units don't need or can't use or have little incentive to use. Better managed corporations have found ways to avoid that problem. They draw local business unit leaders into the governance of central R&D functions. They ensure that the central R&D teams work collaboratively with staff from the units on innovation projects. And they invest in developing the skill base of staff in those operating units so they can participate effectively in these projects. A socialist planning process could dramatically accelerate innovation by following just such a model. Imagine how we could accelerate innovation from a policy of federal funding for industry level and regional R&D centers, chartering them to collaborate with the relevant enterprises in those efforts, and investing in the development of the innovative capacity of the entire workforce so everyone can contribute. Innovation could also be accelerated under this socialist planning system by expanded opportunities for entrepreneurship. We often hear people celebrating the startup culture in the US today and the effectiveness of our venture capital industry in the new wave of SPACs. But it's easy to forget how much entrepreneurship is in fact limited, constrained by the fact that the vast majority of Americans have neither the time nor the resources needed to develop innovative ideas. Socialism could break down that barrier, incentivizing enterprises to create opportunities for intrapreneurship and by charging public investment banks to invest in promising startups. They would have much lower thresholds than the venture capital firms do. So I've talked about the challenges of democracy and innovation in a government planning process to address our climate challenge. We should also talk about one more challenge, and that's accountability. Many people worry that it would be hard to ensure the accountability of such powerful government planners and of the enterprises under their control. Capitalist firms, the skeptics argue, are held accountable by market competition, while government-directed enterprises or government agencies that are doing the directing could not be held accountable by that mechanism. And to this concern, I think there are two responses. First, we shouldn't exaggerate how brilliantly market competition has worked to ensure accountability. When it comes to CO2 emissions, just to take that one case, it's been an abject failure of a kind that threatens civilization as we know it. Second, and conversely, we shouldn't overstate the difficulty of ensuring accountability in the public sector. Our system is clunky, but we already have a wide array of mechanisms that work pretty well in aggregate to ensure accountability. We have regulators, courts, the legislators themselves, public advocacy. Moreover, if we think competition can be a useful complement to these planning mechanisms, there's no reason why enterprises within the socialist planning system couldn't be put into healthy competition and differentially rewarded depending on their ability to meet our planned goals. This already happens in many well-governed public services. So to sum up, 4 points. The climate crisis is a genuine emergency. It requires broad and urgent action. 2, its emergence as a crisis reflects some very basic features of our capitalist economic system. 3, given the magnitude and urgency of this crisis, we can't overcome it within the framework of the capitalist system. We have no choice but to transition to a more socialist system where government strategic planning replaces market competition across big swaths of the economy. And finally, we have good reason to think that this socialist strategic management of the national economy could operate effectively and democratically by leveraging some of the lessons learned in corporate strategic management over the last decades. Perhaps one final reflection on the role of business in this. It's unrealistic, I think, to expect business to lead the way to this new socialist system, but we can hope that business leaders will accept the need for that transition and not let pride or greed drive them to block it. Moreover, the wealth of management expertise in the business community will be more valuable than ever as we begin to manage together in a more deliberate, purposeful way this vast, complex system that is the US economy.